Miguel on the in the one.
Let me go back a couple of statements.
Okay.
He has said, when I looked at this treaty for many years, I don't believe that our people in 1836 would never sign this thing. What it says, like when you go to page 1, Guy wonder Jana Shikta Bamin Zina, Kitanama, Kitaki, and the Zapana Zina. The newcomers will not take over your rights. But they did, you know. This is the way this thing is written. On the top page, we start here. To able to understand each other what this document is, eh? And it never did happen because we came into 1862. And then they say on page 2, where he just left out, says, you know, the white man has taken over. However, if you work on your lands, it will be yours. We already own the lands anyway. So, you know, they're telling us, only if you work your lands, hello, if only if you work your lands, it'll be yours. And I don't believe for a moment there was an interpreter here, or something was not recorded. Something happened here. That's up to that point. Up on the.
Watching the begin number, Manda Enjigi dying. In over the web the shame, yet no it taken. Manda Aw, which is Avigan, here on Eshnikari. Masap gay, always should have been also. When they have skated, Masap is the bent also on the Udawas, Minachip was.
North Shore, I think, can you hear me? I'm here, okay? Me when I saw Kidashmabal, the writer, is it the bend of Mondo on the North Shore in Huron, you upstage the same way you owned your lands here. Me as Biga David. As I'll go along here, as just to give you an idea what's written here.
Norm the man. Is een Kim Gotmanden, Pino, Kena Gita Singmanden, Ibu Kim Nishin, Abjugo, the Nishin, Jida, Boshunda, on the Nishnavik, on the Nenduendik, Beka Wayajik. We want Moshkaji that water on the Yapski engine. We the Shukundunche, Wind the Marburg, Mava, Kitche Oswa, Chigama. We begin none of the machine. We know we begin the word, the relish novel. We not be the chair.
Well, this is getting worse. Europeans who wish to be civilized. They're really running us down here as well as to congregating Norjik. We want people in on the island. One people this shame. You know, guys in the upstate come and mix you. You will be separated from the whites, from the Jaganash, should be good. Now, come in the morning, this, get them all up, chicken man. He's spinning it on the snow, to get in the neck, get the vendors through on. Get in the chicken man, you got to get on the vendors through. They're asking us to give up what we already own in order to be civilized, that we could stay here and fish. Crazy. Unbelievable, this thing.
Now, how this kilo, what I was, Minachip was. At the end of the month, we've getting them machine. We now doing them Chigama. Can I just not We'd not kiat sunda. He's been there to make we joy about his be a dick mandam senegan. Monty Kadeshak vegan. Me wedge.
I walk, chip wide. Ich bin wieder in der Weg, wo wir gegeben, der Weg, der Wend auszuhören, wa? Dann dem nicht schön, können Sie nicht tegen. Genau mit der Ende, geht mal was chicken, man. Under your great father's control. Genau mit der Ende, aneinander. Jeder nicht nach weg, geht nicht an sich schon. But that was a bunch of BS. Because they came along in 1862 and said, we were expecting 3,500 Indians on this island. But because there wasn't any, only 1,200 came, then that negates this thing. With the 62 Yivichigade. This is so ridiculous, farce, and a fraud in Munajin Kata. And to be totally understand this thing, we're going to add some more little sentences here, what it really does to us, see? Where we'll probably get our help from our legal counsel here. And each system, whatever I understand it, this didn't really happen, you know. The government is telling us, you don't own these islands. If you give them up, they never will give them up, you know. I don't know where they got the idea that they owned them in the first place. You know, this is so strong in our language. 1862, we're doing that. It's longer. And you'll be amazed how it is written. There are couple of documents relating to this. Somebody interpreted into Indian, our Anishinaabe language. We can't even make them out. One sentence is about one paragraph long. There's nothing in between. God, that's good on. But anyway, that's it.
Okay, John, do we have some?
English, Brenda? English, Linda, for your time and the effort and your energies that you provided in translation.
Plus these here.
So again, it's equally important that we thoroughly understand again what's being said in our language as far as the translation goes.
We're going to proceed with Hardy's presentation on some different aspects of the history of the island's claim.
Oh, Chief, I'm very honored to be part of your team, and especially to be able to have been associated with Ronnie, Eugene, and Henry for all these years. We've been on this thing for at least 40 years. We started this thing 1975, which is 35 years ago. And I don't think we got the first base yet, unless somebody can prove me otherwise. I've always been interested in the rights of our people, the way that we have been denied or tricked into different treaties. I stepped into the process again about a month and a half ago and worked on a different scale, on a different route. The same as we did with Point Brandine. We worked towards the development of an asset that may take us into economics. And I'm going to stick with that portion of our delivery. There are a few things that we missed in the Grandine negotiations for one reason or another. And you know what, folks? The signatories of 62, 36, or 50, the Anishinaabe over 150 years ago knew what they were doing. They left an awful lot of openings in those documents, those treaties. They saved, you often hear that, for future generations. A generation ago, or way back since 1836, those documents were signed, and our great-grandfathers said, and they knew, we would come along and grab what is real justice. We're the children of that era. Now we are here today to strengthen those documents and our rights for our future children. So this goes on. We're not going to settle everything. One of the things you want to understand that we already have our foot in the door. We just got to keep going. Point Grundy land claim only deals with the boundaries. There is an awful lot to be to look forward to in the Grundy claim under the 1850 treaty. I am, through my research and through the older people or elders that I've been associated with for many years, Hemwick, Chigwaja, Jingwa, and a lot of them. We traveled through Grundy, Philip Edward Island, Killarney, all over the place. In negotiating tables, I was with them. As I walked in this process a month and a half ago or so, I learned that we now have quite a bunch of people, technicians. Unbelievable. There was an awful lot of work done where we are to where we are today. I don't think we need to do any more. Like my colleagues are saying, let's move on ahead. Quit shoveling paper. This is only to keep an update and give you some background of where we are. Eugene talked about him and I went out and measured things with our arms stretched out like this. Now they got an instrument called the GPS, Great People's System. What is it anyway? But then, you know, they can tell where you are, but sometimes I feel they're lost when I don't see them around for a few days. Which is kidding. I want to concentrate on not so much to go into our play, but we talk about economics. To look after our kids. This is very special to me. This is east of Killarney. Up around here.
It goes right up to, God, I hate
This takes us to Chickenishi. Chickenishi, there's a map you will see there. This one, from Killarney to Chickenishi, there's a trail there that leads to Chickenishi, where there was an Indian village, a settlement by Moingams, taking a butcher. You go back a little bit. Where am I? Where's Jiwatmos? Oh, yeah, Manda, Jiwatmos, right here. It's called the cross. There was a cross on the side of a rock the native people tore the moss off the rocks this way and then this way. You know, given the sign of a cross. That was a very sacred burial grounds of our people. You know, the Chickenishi, that is a native settlement. Within this territory, there are burial sites. Those are ours. Those are ours. Ontario, they're always doing things within our territory. It's a provincial park. They've taken away our ancestral grounds where our people are buried. I'm going to go a little bit further to the east, Munda, Philip Edward Island. Philip Edward Island. There's all kinds of historical areas in there I'm going to get Professor Jolie to talk about. They did an awful lot of research, Henry and Carol. What the history behind that. It's ours. Like Mr. Manitowoc, Chief Manitowoc said this morning, there should be no question. You know, we don't have to prove to anybody those are ours. They were taken away. But through the processes, we've got to do those things, I suppose. To me, we can cut some corners here. We have to really, really put our hands up and be strong about this, eh? Sometimes I wonder, and I'll be honest with you, I don't pull any punches. This should never be the back burner. Never. If somebody came to your house and stole the fridge, there's your livelihood in there, you're not going to sit back and say, I hope they had enough to eat. You'd go chasing it. Eh? That's our livelihood. I have documents stating that's where we were, that's where we should be. We gained our living from there. I don't know. When I came in, first thing I heard was, well, we got to start in 1895 of your existence, whatever, when you start losing the resources. I said that's full of baloney. We've been here since 1400s to be documented, eh? 1400, 600 years ago. Besides that, you look at Shigwinda, that's 9,000 years. And archaeologists have proven that, eh? We didn't have to be archaeologists. Pardon me, Julek, I'm not demeaning your title, but you have to have you are adding a lot of ammunition to what we believe, what we know. And I said to myself, why are we fooling around with the Canada's what they want? And I'm sitting in the office, Hardy, take out your historical reports, find something that takes us back to 1862. Like a fool I did. We don't have to do that. But I went back anyway to 1836. That's when we really started losing our use of that territory. I'm going to pass these around after. I don't want to load you up with too much stuff here. But I'm going to pass these on before the meeting is over. Some of the areas, one of the areas that I've always talked about when I first started this research 50 years ago. When we were put on this, or when they said, you know, you could live here in 1836, their move was to get us out of the way. And it's written here. I'm just going to read just one spasm of it. The Bondhead is writing to Lord Glenale. I don't even know how to say that word. It is said, it is evident to see me that we should reap up a great benefit if we could persuade those Indians who are now impeding the progress of civilization. Those cotton-picking Indians are in the way. Let's get them out of the way. Take their resources, we'll put them, here's a sticker, we'll put them on Manitoulin Island. There's all kinds of fish and everything else. Guess what? They came along in 62, took that away too. Impeding the progress of civilization. And it says in Upper Canada, and to resort to a place possessing the double advantage of being admirably adapted to them in as much as affords fishing, hunting, bird shooting, and fruit. They admit that. That's our livelihood, which they want to take away eventually. Yet in no way adapted to the white population. By Jesus, I'm telling you guys, have we ever adapted to the white in an affair system? Not back here. You know, it's, I'm not picking on you, but it's, we have been assimilated terribly. In no way adapted to the white population. Many Indians have long been in the habit of living in their canoes amongst these islands. This is so funny. And from time to time, from every inquiry I could make, and from my own observation, I felt convinced that a vast benefit would be conferred on them if we could move them to on the fishing islands here. You know, that statement has been in my noggin for about 50 years since I've been working on this. And it's still the same thing. When we go to the negotiating table, they're trying to, they're telling us we're in the way. I'll tell you one thing. Right now, we should be in the way. This is where we gotta go. Let's be in the way. Like Chief Manitoulin talked about this morning. Let's be in the way. We have the knowledge to do it. We have all the resources. And I do hope some of the people that have learned the history should have been here today, so that our young children will know our history. That I'm sad about, that we do not have enough of our school system present. And you know, I'm being honest with you. I'm proud of these kids that are sitting around here that are taking part in the development of where we are going to be. Don't forget, it's their kids and our grandchildren, great-grandchildren, hopefully to benefit. This here territory is so valuable. We gotta fight like heck. Only one thing. There's a needle in a haystack, and what we're going to do is fits with the island. I know I've heard people say they want it, but do we want something that's already been used or depleted of resources? Would be no good for tourism. It's out of the way. The forestry is gone. that van came over to the van office, this man here, the chief of Manitowoc. Remember that guy? He really felt this like we're, yeah, whatever his name is, you know, he really put us down. There's no goddamn way you Indians are going to get this, you know, in so many words. And he says, long as my name is alive, that place will remain, you know. So, you know, there are things that we have to look at, whether to pursue them. But there are ways we can, like Fitzwilliam, Philip Edward Island, and that property right there. We got to talk to our people how we're going to handle this. Which way are we going to go? Do we release something, you know, to get something better? Because school went on educate on this, as Mr. Art Manitowoc, Chief Art Manitowoc. I get very emotional. We're still here trying to understand each other and trying to understand the government. A lot of money is being spent, we're borrowing that money. And that's another wrong. We shouldn't borrow anything. At the end of the day, we're going to be doing another signing somewhere. This is the only place, my friends, that we have an outlook on economics. When we did Grandine, we talked about ecotourism, co-management or ourselves with the province on a park, and along with Killarney people who are now band members of ours. They have an awful lot of knowledge in that territory. 15, 16 years later, we haven't even moved towards the economics on Grandine. As soon as the paper was signed, before, you know, when the money got here, we forgot about our Mother Earth, as we call it. We let it drift by, and there's still no control over it. Like I said, I hate to say some of these things. We got to protect what we own. We got to make use of what we own. We got to build something on something of what we own for our children and our grandchildren. That's where I'm at. I've always been there. When I heard these gentlemen this morning, I'm very proud to have been, you know, on my team or their team. Elders are going. There's not too many left. This is a share to our community.
To me, what's hard?
We want to move on to the next issue. I was going to try to give an overview of some of what we've talked about and what brings us to today's context. So as we've heard, in our history, some key points are relevant to the legal context, and I'm not trying to present a legal presentation, but it's important that we understand the legal implications, because as with the reading or the interpretation of the treaty into the language and the difficulty that presents for what our former chiefs would have understood at the time in 1836, Canadian law has established today that the legal interpretation of treaties must take into consideration, as the courts call it, how the Indians naturally would have understood the agreement. And as Hardy has illustrated, it's very difficult to see how our people would have understood that agreement in our language the way it is written. But from the documentary evidence, it's pretty clear what our people understood based on the petitions that our people began sending immediately after this 1862 agreement. They began to petition the government, and for years the government continually denied our understanding of the status of our lands, and that even the government's interpretations changed over the years, whereas Wakomekong's position remained consistent throughout the history. The government had different legal opinions at different times, and these are not consistent. There was also the two levels of government, the Ontario government and the government of Canada, who disputed their jurisdiction or their governance of these same islands. And that took place for over 30 years until they reached some sort of agreement over who was going to govern which. At which time they never consulted with our people regarding the status of these lands, despite the fact that we're submitting written petitions continually. But I just wanted to put this history somewhat in perspective from what I've learned from these chiefs and elders who have spoken here since I started working. They are the ones who guided my learning about our claims, because in the early days I started doing research as a summer student with the Union of Ontario Indians, documenting our land claims, never thinking at the time it would be this long before we could find a resolution. But it's clear that we have to continue the struggle. But in understanding, our peoples continually said these are our lands. They understood the 1836 agreement. And as mentioned before, Bond had no real authority to enter into this agreement, and it was a proposal. It's often been said he made a proposal to the people who agreed to consider it and understood it to be confirming these lands as ours, as they had always been granted to us by the Creator, as was even mentioned in the records. But when you look at the first sentence of the treaty, it refers to 70 snow seasons ago we gathered at the Crooked Place. This is a direct reference to the Niagara Treaty of 1764. Earlier, Henry had talked about the Royal Proclamation, which is a British law over British subjects, which is a part of today's constitutional structure of Canada. It's probably the oldest document that's a part of Canada's constitutional structure, because Canada's constitution is not one document, it's a series of documents and constitution acts, with the Royal Proclamation almost being the founding document for the Canadian people of their governance. But what it set out, it wasn't a law over Indians, it was a law over British subjects, that the only authority to acquire lands from the Indians, as they call us, is the Crown itself. So that was the result of Pontiac's war. He was the great Odawa chief who united some 20 tribes in what sometimes was called the Western Confederacy, that opposed the British after they acquired the right to colonize Canada from the French in 1760. It was 3 years before they could even begin to assert any of their authority, because Pontiac had led this alliance which burned almost all the British forts except for Detroit and Fort Pitt, which were put under siege. The British realized they had to do something, so they issued this proclamation and proceeded to assemble, invite the nations to meet with them at Niagara, where the Niagara Treaty was agreed to, and what that understanding was the understanding of our people with the British in terms of our relationship in the future. Number one, the one that's clear to the white people, is that they would not take our lands without our consent, and this is sometimes said where they established this so-called treaty-making process. But more importantly, from our own people's understanding, which is in the documentary records, was the promise of protection. If we allied with the British Crown, we would be protected. And to symbolize that, they did two wampum belts, one being the 1764 belt, which, when you look at the different statements of our people, their understanding of it was, sometimes it's called the covenant chain, but the symbols on that belt are, on one side, the Indian person, the nation, representing the nation, Mishnabik nation, and a chain that goes to a boat. Well, the Mishnabik people are on the rock. There's a rock that represented Quebec, which was the port where the British were governing their new colony from. And the chain extended to a boat. And what the British said was, whenever you are in need, just pull on that chain and we will supply your wants, your needs. And this understanding was solidified not only through the belts. The other belt was the 24 nation belt, which showed the 24 nations that were agreeing to peace. This is a true peace and friendship treaty, establishing the very basis of British North America and Canada today. But to also solidify this was what they called the annual presents, supplies, flour, gunpowder, sugar, various cloth, axes, these gifts that were meant to symbolize the alliance of the nations with the British Crown. So every year, the Anishinaabeg people from all around the lakes and as far west as west of Lake Superior would gather either at the Sioux, Manitoulin, or down in Coldwater to receive the annual distribution of presents. And that was what was taking place on that August day in 1836, when Sir Francis Bondhead, the newly appointed Lieutenant Governor, showed up and came up with his idea to set aside the islands in Lake Huron for the Anishinaabeg peoples, and as Hardy had referred to earlier, because they wanted to clear away the people, our people who they considered in the way in southern Ontario, which was quickly being settled. And so I think from what I've learned, you can't possibly look at the 1836 agreement without reference to the relationship established in the Niagara Treaty of 1764. And in the historical documents, you can find at various times when chiefs would repeat that agreement from Niagara. So that's why it's so important. And so leading from that time, it's clear that our people had the understanding that the 1836 agreement was confirming our ownership of the area, our control of the area since time immemorial, and that we simply agreed that other Indian people could come and live with us, which was always the case, from what I understand anyway, and that the that the alliance, the treaty would continue, the protection that was promised. So then we moved on to the events in 1862. As we know, in 1861, all the chiefs on the island turned down the proposal for a further for a surrender of parts of the island. The government schemed, as we know from their papers, to try to induce an agreement again. And as was mentioned earlier, when the gathering took place here, all the chiefs stood firm and said, no, we don't want to part with our land. And as we know, the Wacomicongue people left the gathering, I think it was on the Saturday, and on that Sunday, barrels of whiskey were brought out. From what I understand, it was around the point here on Mantuani. A whiskey trader was camped a little farther up the bay, and that's where the whiskey was distributed. And then, as we also know from the historical records, it refers to Wacomicongue's petitions talked about when they came back on the Monday or the Tuesday, this agreement had been signed, and the chiefs, and the people who signed it were not all chiefs. We've also documented that in the work we've done over the years. We've documented where some of these people were never identified as chiefs before or after that 1862 agreement, and that they cried. Some of these chiefs cried to the chiefs from Wacomicongue when they realized what had happened. They didn't even know what they were doing. So this was all documented, not only in petitions from Wacomicongue, but the petitions from the Indians on the western side of the island as well, that petition to say, we never intended to surrender our lands, and certainly not the islands. So in 1975, when our chief, Wakigizik, issued a declaration, and the council at the time issued a declaration that these islands are ours, that we have never surrendered them. This was the beginning, I guess, what I call our modern era, where we began to try to rectify this situation. It was sent to the government, and of course the government didn't do much about it. During this time, as you might recall, in 1969, the Trudeau government issued the white paper where they proposed the abolition of the Indian Act and Indian status, and this caused the unification of the First Nations people across the country. And that's when I was just a kid, and so I was really influenced by that time when people across the country said, well, you can't do this without our cooperation. And the two issues that were raised that the government could not deny was, what about our treaty relationship, what about our treaties, and what about our land claims? And the government realized then that they weren't going to be able to do this without somehow trying to address these issues. So as usual, the government response was to develop a policy, and they began developing these land claim policies at that time, and developed another policy called the Specific Claims Policy, which deals with claims arising from the administration of Indian lands or other assets, or specific treaty provisions or breaches of legislative statutory requirements, as they call it. And that was the beginning of the Specific Claims Policy. Of course, from the beginning, First Nations made submissions that we need an independent body to deal with these claims, that you know, it's not right for the government who did these wrongs to be acting as judge and jury in claims against itself. And I won't go into all the details, but this is where most of my work centered, was on trying to create this independent claims body to address claims in a fair way. The policy, though, is fraught or is characterized by a conflict of interest. You're submitting your claims to the party that did the wrongs, or as George Bush liked to say, the evildoers. But in any case, this is where the policy, but being the only game in town besides going to court, which was found to be overly expensive and adversarial, the government continued to promote negotiations through this managed process. So from 1983, I believe, was the actual beginning of specific claims, to the Oka crisis in 1990. There was approximately 40 specific claims settled out of over 400 submissions, which is a pretty poor record, really. So in 1990, after this, the famous Oka crisis, I was involved from that point with the Assembly of First Nations in seeking to reform these policies, pointing out the unfairness and the conflict of interest. The idea was to eliminate the conflict of interest. So we can explore these issues more in future if you wish, but I'm just trying to set the context of what we're trying to deal with here. Throughout that time, our people were developing the land claim and actually submitted a formal claim statement in 1984 to the specific claims process, and waited over 10 years, for a response, and that characterized the typical specific claims process. In 1994, 95, 96, we received 3 letters from the government rejecting the claim, saying that it didn't meet the criteria set out in the policy, that the government had breached some lawful obligation, to our people. And they were basically characterizing their rejections as saying that these islands that we were claiming were surrendered, by the 1862 treaty. Of course, we repeated that we did not participate in that treaty and that we never have surrendered our land. So in 1997, just to conclude this little historical perspective, the Mike Harris government, the Conservative government in Ontario, launched an amalgamation process of municipalities, reorganizing the municipalities in the province. And they were creating this new municipality called Northeastern Manitoulin and the Islands, NIMI. Well, that alerted our people, from what I understand immediately, that what's going on here, these are our islands. So in order to protect ourselves, we developed the court case, which was filed in 96, I believe. And the statement of claim was amended in 97 from this original claim, basically dealing with these 40-some islands, to include the entirety of the original 1836 reserve, which in our view was illegally taken in 1862. That led to court-supervised discussions that the courts will often do when there's a court case involving First Nation claims. They'll try to promote discussion outside of the court to see if there's any basis for another way to resolve the issue. And if that doesn't work, then the court case can resume. In this case, from what I understand, the claim, they were working on trying to establish the basis for negotiations, outside of specific claims, I guess. And then the government said, well, we can't finance that. The government of Canada said, we cannot finance that. We'll need to, the only way to finance it is through specific claims. So they offered to reconsider the claim under specific claims. And in 2004, the minister and department wrote to Pumacong offering to negotiate under the specific claims policy. And I guess that's when I came home. I was asked to come down and assist and when I seen what was offered, there was an offer to negotiate with some conditions, including preconditions, we called them, wherein they said we would have to agree that we were going to surrender the western side of the island and other islands as a precondition to negotiations. Well, that was found to be unacceptable, so we spent 2 years trying to clarify with the government what they were offering to negotiate. And initially, because this arose out of the court-supervised discussions, we thought they wanted to address our claim that was in the court. What we discovered was, no, we're only offering to negotiate the claim that was submitted in 1984, the so-called 41 Islands claim. And we can't deal with the others. You'd have to submit a new claim, to include the other islands, and it would take us years to review, etc., they said. So this was some of the things we went back and forth on. And so at one point, what broke the deadlock was there was a negotiator appointed at one time, and I don't have his name right in front of me, but he was a Nishnawbik man from northwestern Ontario, and he said, well, if that's your problem, that precondition, just send me a letter and ask me to get my mandate changed, he said. So that's what we did. We wrote him a letter telling him, explaining why these preconditions were unacceptable and that they should be removed, and that we negotiate the claim, and this term has been used before, but the intent was that it would be without prejudice to our other outstanding rights and our court case, that it would not affect that. Because it was clear to me that we're entering these negotiations on the basis that we don't agree on the effect of the 1862 treaty. But with the governments and us, what we understood is, okay, it's worth trying to resolve this claim to these islands just off our coast, and we'll deal with the bigger issues later. So it's all the parties agree. We should be able to resolve these issues without affecting those larger issues, which are going to take many more years to resolve. So that was the basis of our acceptance, and the BCR in 2006 accepting the revised offer to negotiate. So there was the original letter in 2004, and then there's the letter in 2006, which offers to remove the preconditions we objected to and to negotiate without prejudice. So that's what led us into entering this specific claim negotiation process. So it's important to be understood that we still have the court cases there on hold, unaffected by these negotiations. Of course, we won't know the real effect until we have a settlement agreement drafted, if we get that far, and we can look at it and see what the wording means. So that was the idea, to try to resolve this claim with the islands most immediate off our coast. Now, I've tried to condense everything into a few minutes, but I think it's worthwhile because we want to get into discussion and talk about our strategies for moving forward. So I'll try to summarize what has taken place in the negotiations to date, and some of the other work we've been doing to support those negotiations. The first order of business in the negotiations was to design a protocol agreement. The protocol agreement guides the negotiation process, so it sort of sets out the rules and parameters between the parties and what we're negotiating. And we also began, under the specific claims policy, we're to borrow money to negotiate, at least from the federal contribution to the negotiations, that will be repaid out of the settlement when it's concluded. Then we began to talk about the special studies and appraisals that will assist the negotiation discussions. At this point, the government mentioned to us that Well, we also agreed that we would try to undertake joint studies wherever possible to save time and effort, and that the three parties would agree on criteria, terms of reference for any required studies, and that those would be undertaken rather than each of us doing our own studies and then arguing about the results. It was agreed we try, this joint approach, which is the trend in specific claims in recent years. And then the government proposed this proxy model, which we've talked about before, but is essentially a formula for calculating loss of use, which uses a projection, a model that projects rising value based on what they call lost rent. And it's supposed to use the maximum value of the lands involved and then project it over that specified period. Where we ran into a problem here is, and we'll talk about the proxy model more tomorrow, but the essential point is that the government was saying to us previously, in calculating this compensation, since we're using this proxy model, we're not going to be examining every piece of land and every transaction and every potential use and argue about whether you would have used it for that or not. We'll use the proxy model, but that requires that projection needs a starting date. And they were saying, since you had access to some islands through these years and that your access wasn't restricted, this is what they said, we should look at a date somewhere in between. And somehow this date of 1895 was put on the table, that would make the adjustment to take care of what they saw as a number of islands that they didn't think we had any problem using. Now, as we discussed with the council, we didn't have free, unencumbered use of these islands, throughout that history. Even prior to 1862, it was pointed out, there was alienations taking place. So we resolved to develop the rationale and required evidence to present to them, to show them that 1862 is a more reasonable date to apply than this later date. And by showing them this evidence that there had been alienations and so forth prior to 1862. So that's what we've been working on. But in the meantime, as we talked about earlier, the negotiators, we were informed that the federal negotiator was leaving and that a new one would be appointed. That was in November, and here we are now in March, and a new negotiator has not been appointed. We were just informed this morning that they have a person in mind. They can't tell us who it is, but they should be appointed and in place by April 1st. So after our effort, though, to discuss these issues, which are nuances, are particular discussions at this table only, they're not general issues, they're issues that pertain to our claim and what was discussed up to that point. So now with the new negotiator, we're going to have to educate them and somehow get them caught up on how we got here, to where we're at. Ontario has already stated at our last negotiation session in November that they support using 1862. The provincial negotiator clearly said, from what he's learned, the date of 1862 it resonates with the community, he said. So I think that showed some understanding on his part of what's involved here, that he recognized that there's some great importance in the community, with that date and the alienation taking place, or the taking of these lands, essentially, in the government's view. So this is what we're preparing for the next meeting. So what we really wanted to get at in our session, the workshop here this week, was agreement on what we're going to put forward. And we had talked with the chief and council previously about having presentations made by our elders of our history, and so to give the government an understanding of how we see things. Obviously it's going to be different in the way they see it, but they need to understand how we see it. and that we would present some of this documentary evidence that shows these alienations were taking place. And the clear evidence from the Shanahan report, and I've copied a copy of the summary of the Shanahan, which is one of the historical reports we have. We also have the Smith report and other reports, but in this particular report, there's clear indications of where the government was leasing these islands prior to 1862. In the 1850s, they were leasing the islands and even trying to lease the islands to the Indians, saying that we didn't have fishing rights. And despite our repeated petitions and protests that our islands were being interfered with. So sometimes it's interesting to read these historical documents and see where, like, Gibbard, the famous fisheries overseer, was saying he was outraged at seeing that the Indians had pillaged the white people's fishing gear and stuff that they had on Lonely Island and other islands, calling them thieves and so forth, when what all they were doing was controlling their own territory because they never agreed to have these their lands leased. So it just shows how there's a different perspective on the two sides. So, but once we can resolve this issue, then this negotiation process could move forward more efficiently. And in closing, I just wanted to mention the issues that we would be facing if we resolve this and choose to move forward in the negotiations. Number one is the communications, and I've handed out previously the communications products developed, by the communications working group, subgroup of the negotiation table, and the main one there is the fact sheet. And so we'll have to review these again when they come back, because they're both in the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs for Ontario and the Minister of Indian Affairs for Canada. Their offices must approve these communications materials. So we'll want to look at those and see the changes they're proposing. And there's also the internal question and answer document, because in the protocol we agree we'll inform each other when we comment to third parties about the claim, that we'll give each other prior notice, and that we will try to be consistent in our factual information. And that's what the question and answer document is intended to do. So it's up to us to decide what to do with those items. I keep bringing them up, and hopefully at some point we'll have a focus, because the reason I think that's important is because that's what's going to be in the public eye, from the negotiation table, or at least that the governments are going to be using. So it's very important that we're comfortable with what's in those documents. And of course, with those is the outreach strategy, it's called. The outreach strategy reflects the communication strategy, which is the fourth document, but the outreach is the process and how it will unfold, because, and this is at the government's insistence, they want to unfold the public exposure of this claim in a timed or organized sort of way, to their minds anyway, wherein there would be the release of a fact sheet, and that it looks like Ontario will want to put that on their website, and then the initiation of consultations with third-party interests, such as the municipalities, the voters, the various interest groups that are out there. Of course, Ontario has a list of the interest groups that they say that they have to consult with, and also, there's the consideration of consultation with other First Nation communities in the area. So that's just, there's those. But once we can resolve this, this date issue and decide that we want to proceed with this proxy model, the appraisal study can take place. And we have an appraisal committee that's considering the draft of that. We have the draft. We need to be comfortable with that, the terms of reference for the appraisal. Then the appraisal committee will select the appraisers. The other part that fit into that was the listing of the islands and the identification of the islands. we had the federal government agreed, okay, we're talking about an area. So they were willing to include every piece of land within that area. So we need to look at those. And lastly, down the road, if we begin to develop a settlement agreement, and Hardy's talking about some of the things we might be taking into consideration in developing elements of a settlement package, we'll want to focus on the release clauses. Now, the government likes to call it absolute surrender. The first federal negotiator insisted, oh, we have to call it absolute surrender. But in designing the protocol, we were able to get them to lighten up on the language and look at the concept of releases. And we'll go into that in future as well, the history of that, the language that's used. So in doing the work as well, we've had reliance on all the previous work that this band has done and the work of others as well, and we've had assistance from the various experts. And Pat Julie, the archaeologist, is one of the people that's worked with our people in doing the studies at Point Rondine and in the area. And we've worked closely with the lands planning unit in terms of whenever we go on the ground, the land planning people, Norman Asinaway, John Manitowabi, and Theodore Polan, the other guys have been very helpful throughout these 2 years that we've been involved in this in terms of their familiarity with the islands and Point Rondine. And whenever we go on the land, we try to go with them. Whenever we take government people out there, we try to work with them. And Pat has been working with them as well on the Endangered Species Project, which is to identify the endangered species throughout the islands. And we bought a camera for them to take detailed pictures of these various species, but sharing our work together. We asked them then in exchange to identify any evidence of use of the islands, whether archaeological, historical, or more recent, and we're getting pictures of that. Sam has put together a slideshow that we're going to just let run later. It'll just run on its own once we can get the thing working. And because I know many people probably haven't been out to the islands, and feel free to ask Sam about the pictures, and you'll see pictures of many of the islands in Collins Inlet and the area out there, and some interesting things that were found. So with that, there's a lot more I would have liked to say to try to provide a better perspective, but I know it's important that we have discussions. So with that, and I'm always open to questions and whatever you want. In closing, I just want to say, as the negotiator on this claim, it's not always easy. We have, as I said earlier, many interests and many pressures coming on me. Of course, everyone's got their own idea how we should be doing this. And I think the idea of what we wanted to do here was get together and have a solid, at least a good consensus as to where we're going and how we're going. And as
if anything, when it comes to clear direction as far as certainly this present specific land claim is the focus at this point. But one of the suggestions that has come to the table and from our veteran chiefs is to actually establish a Wakumakong Historical Society, maybe perhaps as an advisory where, again, this knowledge of this rich history is being coming down to all program areas where, again, we're empowering our people with a strong sense of identity, not only with our culture, our language, but our history. So before we go on to questions and maybe comments where we take food for thought, I guess, for tonight, before the end of this session here, that I just want to give an opportunity to Mr. Julik, Pat, And I know, Pat, you've been involved in the historical research and the environmental aspect of things, I guess, when it comes to the physical side of location and whatnot.
It is an education for me. I'm not an expert in land claims. I teach anthropology, archaeology, but I guess the first time I worked with somebody from Wiky was Al Shaw, and I was invited to the table when we started to re-look at the old Shagwinda site in 1990. And then in, I guess it'd be around 2002, we got started on the Point Grandine thing, 2003, and there was about 50 odd sites found with Henry and Carol and other people from the WHO. So you've got a really good group of people here. You don't need experts to tell you what to do. You have the knowledge, I think, here to do this. Or at least that's what I see. You know, you have a lot of experts now doing really first-class work. Like the species at risk thing is being done wonderfully. So I think you should be proud of that. But I don't really know what to say here too much. We did more work along Philip Edward Island on and off in, I think, 2006 and 7. And then we're out on the islands on and off as we could with the lands people. All of these islands have sites on them, almost all of them. A lot of them are, there's a lot of rock structures around the shores. Some of these are burial cairns. Like on Ojig Island, some of them have human bones inside of them. These surveys on the islands were really preliminary surveys, more or less reconnaissance. We didn't have a chance to like measure things in and do real fancy archaeology. It was basically go, take pictures, measure a few things. We didn't disturb any of the rock cairns. Some of them are from the Asia, well, on your shores here, so they are of different ages, but there is some prehistoric, some earlier sites out there as well, particularly on like Philip Edward, we found some really old artifacts and slices. But once again, we just looked at these things very, very, in a very cursory manner. Now the burial sites at Point Grandine, you know, you've got both the Christian type burial grounds on Beaverstone, but then you have the traditional mounds right next to them. So there was both types of burials, some larger mounds, some of them are not as tall as this room or the ceiling, but about half this tall. And then we see the same thing at Chickanishi, near where the little bridge goes across. There's some small mounds that have the depression in the middle. There's a lot of other kind of sites that we don't know what they really are. There's things that they sort of call Puckasaw pits near Thunder Bay, but they're piles of rocks with a kind of a nest in the middle. And there's they are often on lookout sites where you look out across the water, so they might be a Vision Quest site, we don't know. But there are some of those at up here between Chickanishi and Little Cross. And then we found some as well out on Philip Edward Island the other year. Same thing on a high terrace back up in the bush. And then along Collins Inlet, on both sides of Collins Inlet, there's a lot of sites. Mainly historical sites, but all along here there are burials as well at Mazenazing. We've had reports of others, but you know we haven't really done a very detailed survey of Philip Edward. We've looked along the Collins Inlet and a little bit in here at Beaverstone, but we really haven't looked out along this side very much. We just haven't had the time. We haven't gone around the backside of Point Grandine to the Cocker geese.
Gaga geese.
Gaga geese, yeah. And, well, Smuggler, Late Smuggler, was very good. He took us through many of these areas, and we really owe a lot to him for sharing his knowledge and to show us the way too to get through the the hens and chickens and places like that. So I guess that's, well, maybe I'll say a little more about this area in here. If you go a little more towards Killarney, there's the 2,000-year-old burial mounds there that are on the Spiegel property, just when you're coming into Killarney. And yeah, but most of those artifacts are down in Michigan, at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And we are working on these collections a little bit. I was down there a couple times this last year, and we're going to be putting together a report. Professor Greenman from Michigan never finished the work. They excavated it and they took it down there, and they've been sitting in the boxes basically. So we've reanalyzed some of this with some of the people from the States from Michigan and places, and there will be a report on that, and we may include a chapter about the year view on archaeology. Henry's helping me with this right now a little bit. So we're trying to include, the native perspective and keep people informed as best we can. We've talked about repatriation with them. I think down the road sometime it probably will happen. If you've got a repository, if you've got like a museum here or something, a place to keep the stuff safe, then I think you could make a good case to bring it back. Certainly the human remains, there are not very many, they're quite fragmentary, but they could be reburied presumably when it comes to that. Higher, this area here that's Little White Cross, that you could have gone right through the backside of Killarney, so I think it was like a Collins Inlet 2,000 years ago, and the burial mound at Killarney would have been along that earlier waterway. So we see a repeating pattern. As you go inland, there's burials up here near where the road crosses the Chickenishi Creek there. They were found in the 1950s when the former mayor of Killarney, I forget his name, was running a machine there, and they dug up some burials, and then they just moved away and left them, so they're still in the ground there as far as we know. But as you go inland, up the hill towards the park, you find earlier and earlier sites, because the shoreline kept moving up, and all the way up to George Lake, and there's a site there that's about 9,000 years old, like the Shigwinda site in Killarney. So we just see that as the water is retreated, you people just were living on the shores at different periods, and you see sort of a repetitive pattern in the area. There seems to be an argument of whether you people were here all the time in the 1700s or not. Were Odawa here all the way through, and if you could find some artifacts that are characteristic of your people, well, like the pottery at the Al Shawana site, if you could date these things, then I think you could make a case of continuous occupation, if that's an issue. But I guess I hear that this may be an issue in some cases, I'm not sure. But anyway, I'd just like to say I'm happy to work with you in whatever way I can. It's been a pleasure, and I feel welcome here, which is nice. And I'll take any questions about these sites, or about the stuff that we found over the last few years.
You mentioned that there's still some more work that you think needs to be done.
Oh, what, on the islands, or?
Well, I'd be particularly interested in the additional work that you think needs to be done in respect to the islands, especially Phil. And I guess
Well, there is a system, like the Ministry of Culture in Ontario has a way of recording all the sites. Like if you find an archaeological site, like say the Killarney site or the Shake site, it's registered through the Ministry of Culture. It's given a number, it's called a board number, and then it's on the record permanently. So if somebody wants to go and build a resort there or whatever, then they know that this stuff was found there, right? But it's sort of kept secret to some extent, that if you need to know it, then you can get it, but you can't. It's not open to the public to go and disturb these sites, right? So it's they try and, like some sites are well known, you know, like the site in Killarney or the Shake site or whatever. But if it's just some other little site, they try not to publicize and have a lot of maps with dots on. But on all of these islands, if you are planning on developing down the road or whatever, then it's good to know, you know, where these little burial mounds are, if they are little burial mounds. And that's what we try to do at Point Grandine. But it's pretty labor intensive because Philip Edwards is a huge island, right? And the shoreline's really rugged, and the water keeps going up and down. So, you know, what was shoreline a while ago is now grass, and then now it's come up again. So it could take a long time to survey all these islands, but I think that now that there's people in the lands office are getting pretty good at recognizing a lot of these things too. So it's kind of just training the young people to recognize and then report these things. And then if you're out there, if you put a dot on the map and take a GPS location and take a photo, if you get people to collect things, there is a system called avocational archaeologists where you can register sites. So Henry and Carol were both signed up for that a while ago. And so then you can record your own sites. But these forms get sent into the ministry and then it's on record if you want to go through that. You don't have to do it though on Indian reserves. Like it's up to you if you want to do it. But it's kind of considered, I guess, by the government, you know, due diligence if you're going through all this other stuff, or if you're getting money, then. But at any rate, I appreciate that Wikwemekong has been sort of proactive in doing it the right way. I would say, you know, and getting the surveys done, and it's kind of a pain, but it probably in the long run is a good thing to document this stuff. Because we forget. I mean, the knowledge is great, but it is, the land changes, you know, people go and cut down trees and, you know, sites disappear. You know, we're losing a lot of them in the south that way. Any other questions? Yes?
Of the, you mentioned there were some artifacts found.
Years ago? Well,
mostly on the, you're talking about some sites on both sides of the coast that have been owned by
oh yeah. Yeah, well, we usually, like when we're doing these surveys, you'd only collect a few things. Like we don't disturb burial mounds. You just measure, photograph, document where they are. But the collections that we collected were left in the WHO office. And we, you know, put numbers on them and did all that kind of stuff. I presume they're still there. The stuff from this burial mound in Killarney, the Spiegel site, Killarney Bay 1, most of those are down in Michigan. And there are some collections at Laurentian University as well that were dug up in a field, in what we call the habitation area. But there were no bones or anything taken out there. But yeah, they're all looked after.
So the question I had then, in relation to those artifacts is there anything you can extract from those artifacts that would have suggested what they're used for? In other words, what kinds of Odawa activity that
was going on?
Could you extrapolate from those artifacts?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, yeah, archaeologists look at what things, you know, sometimes they're like flint scraping tools, quartzite scraping tools. We did find some pottery, You know, the pots were used for cooking, but there were also a few slate artifacts, which there were earlier on, like the 2,000-year-old site has a lot of these gorgets. It would be almost like a little wampum belt thing, you know, a little decoration. Some pipes were found from the Killarney site, the 2,000-year-old site. These were not pipes like you would. I did have a PowerPoint, but I didn't bring it along. But I'm willing to show it sometime. These are tubular pipes. Like some of them had blocked ends, and they were probably for smoking tobacco, but they could have also been used for other ritual purposes. And in the ones in Michigan, some of those are in Michigan, and some of those were found, some of the pipes, the tobacco pipes, were found with female burials, with the remains of females. So it looks like the women might have been keepers of the pipes as well, which is, or maybe smoked more, as Hardy said here. But yeah, copper as well. The copper there was mainly beads. And the beads had shell beads between the copper beads, different kinds.
And those are dated?
Well, that whole site there, this is on a higher mound just east of Killarney, not too far from, you know, where the Ministry of Transportation has their little thing there, sort of inland from there. The water was up that 1,000 years ago. The site was dated by radiocarbon to about 2,000 years ago. So, but many of these other sites that we looked at along Collins Inlet would have been historic or late Odawa. So it would have been roughly the age of the Shawana site down here, you know, so maybe 500 to 1,000, because earlier on it would have been underwater. But we did find a couple sites, one near the Mishki site. Some of the people from here are related to those people that live there. Mishki, yeah. There was a site on a higher terrace that might have been a little bit earlier, that might have been like 1,500 years ago, and it had some pottery. But lots of boiling stones, fire-cracked rock, probably sweat lodges, and so forth.
Thank you very much, Pat.
Well, we've had the presentations for today, and we're open for discussion. I guess specific claims, negotiations, and we have a number of other issues, whether they're claims, outstanding rights, or land disputes that we need to also keep in mind that are not being addressed in these negotiations, and we don't want to forget those items. So perhaps we want to look at a strategy where we work on more than the one issue. We don't want to over tax ourselves, but at the same time we do need to give attention to a number of other issues that I'll review tomorrow. But in terms of comments or discussion in that on what we talked about today,
Jimmy Wedge for inviting me to be here. I'm very thankful for being part of this and being part of the learning about the history of our lands and resources, our traditional territory. I have visited with Roland a few times and asking him, give me a brief about the traditional territories of our people, and I still want to know more, and I would like to pass that on to my kids, and I'm very thankful that we're having this to pass on to our children, because it's very important. I feel it's very important. And also it was mentioned earlier about natural law. That's another thing that I think we should have more gatherings like this and sharing our knowledge and teaching our young about natural law. And I feel that's very important too. I'm just say Jimmy Wedge, and I'm very glad to be here, and it's been a really good day. Anyway. Ani, just for the record here, my name is Cecilia Pitonko. I'm from that counselor. I'd like to thank all the organizers put the material together, and especially former Chief Senator, been working on the islands claim. I'd like to say that I was involved with the islands claim about that time in 1997, and when my carriers had been elected, we are working together and reaching kind of the lead role in getting to the meeting at the he was in Shibanda. They had a meeting. We were starting to form this Navy. And about at the same time, we had gone to Ottawa to present our feelings. And basically, we rejected at that time. So what did we want to do as a next step? We all got back together at the table, our committee group. And from there, we proceeded to do a statement of claim. And also, after that, we started to work on the what they call now the full court order, and a couple of us I went up to Sudbury to the court at that time, along with I think Gary Strahun is here. He was with us at that time, and since that time again, we've been kind of working on this island claim, and I do have concerns about the specific claim process. I know we were told at one of the meetings in Toronto that the next day the specific claim process was going to be effective, and I guess maybe that'll be more like a question for tomorrow. And how are we going to address our statement of claim against the specific land claim process? That would be my question. For that, I really appreciate this workshop. The more knowledge that we have about our rights, about our traditional territories, and about all the information that was brought in about the former, I guess, dwellings of people, of the whereabouts of the Adawa people. That knowledge is empowering to give us that basis to say that we have been here for extremely long time, and I really appreciate the ancestors as well who have strived and lived in the territories, and to today that we are on that land still. And we got.
I think our chief is doing a good job in handling this and bringing all the people that bring in valuable resource to the process. I'm kind of getting the feeling after listening to Chief Wiky talk about the 1862 and saying that it is dangerous to the 1836 Bondhead Treaty. So I'm almost feeling that maybe 1836 is where we're going to start, because there's a lot of discrepancies with the Bondhead Treaty. When we heard today the Anishinaabe translation for the exact wording of the Bondhead Treaty, like it's something that our leaders would never have agreed to, because it just didn't make any sense. I think communication is going to be the big key, and we need to ignite that spark with the community and the young people. I think we need more talks like this, more education. I'd like to see more education sessions on specific treaties separately. Like if we had even just talking about 1764 and bringing in the resource people that can educate the community on that, and encouraging a young person to come with us, to have these ongoing. I believe utilizing the Bajamajik would also bring the history to life I was so glad to have gone to the Manitoulin incident, which really brought the history to life with regards to what Roland was talking about, what occurred at Lonely Island. I believe the Jesuit priests at the time were part of that, that history. I think we should also partner up with the Holy Cross Mission. There is a bulletin that does come out, and if we can key in on those eras and whatever history that they have to be placed on the bulletin, I think is another way to bring people to start thinking about our history, and our history is very oral based. So I think we need to have an argument or seek out what other First Nations have done with this, because you have the written documentation, but it's also very prejudiced towards us. Like, we don't have our side of the story, and our people were always, it was never a written language. So I want to learn more about our history, and I'm very glad that Chief Eugene and Chief Wakagijik is putting that to the Chief and Council to this day, that we need to learn our history, and I'm prepared to do that. Miigwech.
My name is Mary Jo Wabno, band counselor, community member of Wikwamkong and Seated Indian Reserve. I too am very grateful for the entire day when this motion was moved to support the two-day information session and looking for some direction on our next steps. I supported that motion along with Chief Councillor Walter Mantuabi. Just getting the overall the oral history and also a brief summary of the different treaties. Thinking back to October when we met as a council, and more recently in February, the question was posed to the council to determine where we want to begin when we look at this proxy model. And at that time, lots of discussion on where do we want to begin, which brings us here today. And hearing and seeing more of our history, and knowing we were not signatories to the 1836 Bondhead Treaty, personally, I guess, as a community member, I think that's where we would need to go back to. When we talk about educating counselors and I guess the community at large, this is the first step. If we really take a good look, and we heard earlier, take a good look at the treaties that were signed, but not without Wikwamkong signing, I think the community members should be given that information, whether it's in the public forum, whether it's in the schools, and I truly believe also it should be done within the schools. I'm not certain of any of this is being presented to the students in the schools. I think that would be a big step that we need to take and support as a council. So again, speaking back to this, the specific claims, and I know we got hung up on the proxy model and securing a date on where we go back to. I would think if we were to select a date, we would go back to 1836 for sure. Maybe earlier than that, but 1836 for discussion purposes, I guess, today and tomorrow. And I think co-councillor Chief Walter Mantuabi, I think that's what the direction we're hoping to get today, and by the end of tomorrow. What's our next step? And I think the other question I have, and I'm hoping to have an answer or some kind of where do we go from here? Like, do we need to be stuck in the specific claims process, or at any point can we just say, let's just go to court and let's just fight the government for what is rightfully ours? Like, why are we depending on their money to get us what is rightfully ours, and not worry about them giving us money to get back what belongs to us and follow their policy, the specific claims procedure process. And so that means investing our own funding, investing our own resources to reclaim what belongs to Wakumakong and see the Indian Reserve. So that's one question I have, and I'm hoping we can get some maybe further discussion or direction on where we want to go with that. Miigwech.
The council and to people of Wakumakong for inviting me to be a part of this important meeting as well. And I also want to say miigwech to Roland and Brenda and Sam and others in the shop there for organizing an important session like this. It's a lot of work, and so I wanted to make sure you know how appreciative I am of the work you guys do and the support that you provide me in the meetings. I also wanted to say how important it is to be at a meeting like this where we're in the presence of and hearing from 5 chiefs. We heard a lot of good information about the 1862 treaty and the 1836 treaty from Chief Wakigijic, and Chief Palchis shared a lot of good information about the intent and the purpose of the Royal Proclamation and how that becomes part of the, I guess, the legal fabric by which claims are looked at and surrenders are looked at. Chief Arthur Eugene Manitowi shared a lot of information about the treaty process and the whole efforts and struggles that people like himself and Hardy worked on over the years to get the recognition of Wakumakong's rights and get its claims recognized. And Chief Walter Manitowi as well shared the importance of staying focused on the work we're doing. And of course it's always good to hear from Chief Fox directly about the ongoing work that she's doing to keep us all focused on the resolution of this claim. I was really glad to hear a lot of the historical information that Hardy shared about the history of the Odawa people, especially the Odawa understanding of the spirit and the intent and the understanding of the Bondhead Treaty of 1836. This is the kind of information I think we need and the people we need at our negotiation table, so that the federal and provincial governments can hear from our own people and not just go by what we have on the written paper. There's often gaps in what you see on the written paper, and as Hardy and Henry and Ronnie have said earlier this morning, often it was the British person that held the pen on the when those written records were produced, and it's always important to have the Anishinaabe, the oral history perspective on things. So there's a lot of good information shared today, and I'm really glad that I was part of that. But having said that, I think there's also some things I think that we can also do. Think about doing some right away. Mary Jo talked about the importance of making sure that the information we shared here today finds its way into the schools. We've been at this now. If you go back to 1862, the struggle to get the islands returned to Wakumakong is now going on over 145 years. And so, given that there's, we hope not, but there's some likelihood that we're going to need that our younger generations to also know about the history of the efforts to get Wiky's islands back. And it's really important that the young people know the history of the treaties, know the history of the Odawa and the Ojibwe people, and that they now become empowered to take on the battle. Roland talked about some of the other claims that have to be advanced. Eugene talked about the boundary being more on this side, for example. That's one of the outstanding pieces of work I think that needs to be looked at. There's also, all of the oil and gas exploration that took place on Wiky lands, and whatever happened to all those oil and gas revenues. There's another claim there that needs to be looked at, and it's important to empower the young people with that unfinished business, and the way to do that is to make sure they know their history and they know their treaty and they know what's rightfully theirs, because we may not be around for the next 140 years. But the other most important thing I want to say is I'm glad Gordy was taping what people had to say here today. I think that's good that we videotape what people like Henry had to say, what people like Ronnie Waukesha had to say, and Eugene and Hardy. But I can't emphasize how important it is to take the time, and I don't know what it's going to take to do a proposal and find a budget, but those people, Henry, Ronnie Waukesha, Eugene, Hardy, and others in this community need to be videotaped outside of this process where we spend them over the islands and just get them talking about what they know, because Mary Jo talked about maybe going to court one day, and if we do that, that's many years down the road, 2 or 3 years down the road, and like I said, a lot of the evidence is on paper, but I can't emphasize how important it is to have that oral history. So we need to videotape that history. We need to videotape what the elders know about their understanding of the treaty and their understanding of the history and history and use and occupation of those islands. Because when we do go to court, or if we want to teach the young kids, we may not have the luxury of having these real valuable resources and gifts that your community has, and so you need to preserve what they have, because it's part of who you are and part of your history, and that needs to be, I think, a priority that needs to be looked at, so they can start videotaping their oral history and their evidence, because you'll always need that. And the other thing I just want to add is I think Tish mentioned how important it is for communications, and these kinds of sessions and forums are really good, and we need to think about having more of them as well in the community as well, at the high school, and more, because people's level of awareness and understanding will be raised, and people will provide the support that we need to make sure that you get those beautiful islands back that Sam showed us pictures of. So it's always nice to have sessions like this to get the direction that we need, and I look forward to more of the same. So, Chimiwich.